In the last section, we introduced the idea of state into our app component. Now, while that refactor is still fresh in our minds, I want to go through a very quick flow diagram to help you understand exactly what happened from the time that our application was first loaded up to the browser all the way to the point in time where we saw our latitude appear on the screen. All right, so I'm going to zoom in here and we'll go through this thing step by step. So first things first, we loaded up the index.html file inside of our browser, and that requested our JavaScript file with all of our React code inside of it. So the JavaScript file was loaded by the browser and then executed. When that file was executed, we created a new instance of the app component. Remember that the first function that is going to be called inside of our component automatically is the constructor function. We are not required to define the constructor function. We can optionally define it if we want to do some initial setup when our component is first created. If we do choose to define the constructor function, then we have to make sure that we call the super function inside of it. If we don't call super, we'll end up with an error. So we called the constructor function, we called super, and then right after that, we initialized our state object. So we created a new JavaScript object right here with all the different properties inside of it that we want to use inside of this component as state. In our case, the only property that we care about right now is lat, short for latitude. If for some reason we also cared about the user's longitude, then we would have also assigned a longitude, or maybe long for short, property to this thing as well and initialized it to be null. But in this case, we don't care about the longitude at all, we only care about the latitude. Now, after creating this object, we then assigned it to the this.state property. As we mentioned in the last section, there are many different very special property names inside of React components. We've already seen that the render function is a very special function. It must be called render and it must return some amount of JSX. We've also seen that there is a this.setState function, which is built into our component automatically by subclassing React.component as well. And finally, this.state is a very important and very specially named property too. If we had assigned this object right here to like my state, or something like that, this would have not worked the way we had intended. If we want to use state, we have to assign it to the state property like so. Okay, so we assign that state object, and then the next thing that happened was we called that geolocation service. Now, one thing that I want to make sure that is really, really clear here, because this is very challenging for sometimes people to understand when they're first getting into JavaScript, particularly if they're coming from non-synchronous or synchronous languages such as Java, is that this line of code right here, we called getPosition, and we provided it a callback function. This callback function right here is not going to be invoked until we eventually return from the constructor. So we're going to run super with props. We're going to run this assignment right here. We're going to run getCurrentLocation, and we're going to give it the callback. And then we're going to return from the constructor function. But this callback right here is not going to run until some point in time in the future when we finally successfully fetch our position. So this setState call right here does not actually occur while we are running the constructor. It's going to run at some point in time in the future. Okay, so after that, React then takes our component and it calls its render method. Our render method then returns some amount of JSX, and that gets rendered to the page as HTML. So then we wait for some period of time, and we finally get the result of our geolocation request. I got a little stray text there. Okay, so we finally get the result of our geolocation request. So we then execute that callback, this one right here. We take the position object, we pull our latitude out of it, and we call setState to update our state on our component. We update our state by calling setState, and when we call setState, React is going to automatically see that we updated a property on our state object. Remember, anytime that we update our state object, React is going to almost instantly re-render the component. So React saw that we updated a state property. It then called our render method a second time. Our render method then returned some amount of JSX, which was then used to update the content on the screen. Now, one thing that's really important to understand here is the fact that our app component was actually rendered 2 times. One time when our application first booted up right here, and then a second time after we updated our state down here. So there actually was a very small gap in time where our component was rendered onto the screen without any number right there. So for a very small split second of time, we saw latitude, the colon, and then nothing right after that. And then only after we got our geolocation request completed do we finally see a number up here right here. I can actually prove that to you very easily. I want you to reset the permissions by clicking on the little I right there, assuming that you're using Chrome. And you can find location and reset it to ask default like so. So then I'm going to refresh the browser. Okay, so what's happened at this point? At this point, we're back here. We have gone through the process of calling the constructor. We called the geolocation service. When we called the geolocation service, it popped up this little approval request thing right here. And then immediately after that, React has already called our component's render method, taken that JSX, and shown it on the screen, with our state, or our lat right here, being equal to null. Now, when we render out null inside of a component, the component does not show the word null. It just appears as a blank. So at this point, we have not completed that request to get our location. And you can't really see behind this thing, but if I inspect the element, you'll see right here that that div contains the word latitude and nothing after it whatsoever. It's only after I click allow right here that we're going to finally call this.setState, which is going to cause our component to re-render with an actual value of this.state.lat. And so now I'm going to click on allow right here, and you see now that number finally appears. And you saw that very brief flash right there as that div was updated with a value inside of it. Okay, so that's it. That is state. Now, I know that it's been kind of laborious to go through these last 3 videos talking about state, but I found that if you just kind of dive into it head first and really explore some of the very fine and minute details around it, it makes life a lot easier down the road. So now that we have a reasonable idea of how state works, let's continue in the next video, and we're going to start to think about how we can continue working on our application.